on part 1 of the Unit 2 study guide, so this is for the National Government Unit. So the first question is asking you about the principles of the Constitution. So there are 6 principles you really need to know. The first one is popular sovereignty. And when you look at the word popular sovereignty, popular in government means people. And then sovereignty, if you look at the root of the word, like right here in the middle, reign, people rule. In this nation, people rule through voting. And so every 2 years, we actually have elections going on. So right now, your next election date or the next time when we see a good example of popular sovereignty is November 6th. So every 2 years, we're voting on new politicians to fulfill offices that are open. The next principle is limited government. And what limited government is talking about is that the government cannot be and is not all powerful. The government has limits. They have rules, and we call it the rule of law. In the rule of law, no one, not even the president, is above the law. And you saw this, like a really good example would be like the Watergate scandal. So presidents can be impeached. Any executive member, matter of fact, can be impeached. And any member of the judicial branch can also be impeached. So just because you have a government job, like you're the president or you're a Supreme Court justice, it doesn't mean you can do anything you want. You still have to follow the Constitution just like everybody else. And you also have to follow, just all the laws, okay? So when you look at the limited government, when President Nixon does the whole Watergate scandal, he tries to claim that he's above the law. And this principle of the Constitution says, no, you're not. The next principle of the United States Constitution is separation of powers. In separation of powers, each branch has an actual job. They have a role or responsibility that they and only they are supposed to do. Now, there are some overlaps, okay, and that's fine. Like the president does have legislative lawmaking ability, but pretty much your laws are made by the legislative branch. The executive branch, therefore, enforces the law, and the judicial branch, your court system, interprets the law. So for your federal government, your legislative branch is known as Congress. For the executive branch, it's the president and the vice president and his cabinet. For the judicial branch, you're looking at the United States Supreme Court. So when you look at like legislative, LL, law, legislative, executive, EE, executive, enforce, judicial, J, judge, judicial, JJ. Okay, so just little easy things to help you memorize like what the 3 branches actually does. The next one is checks and balances. In checks and balances, each branch limits the power of the other branch. Checks and balances, like they're constantly self-monitoring each other. So each branch kind of monitors and watches what the other branches are doing. And if one of the branches oversteps their power, then it's the other branch's job to call them on it. So Congress, your legislative, makes the laws. So Congress has a law. It's a proposed law. It's called a bill. They send that bill to the President of the United States, who's your executive. If the President looks at this bill and says, nope, Congress has got it wrong, this is not what the people want, this is not the true will of the people, then the President is allowed to veto it. Veto means he's canceling it. He is not signing this bill into law. Now, even though the President has the power to veto, Congress has the power to override his veto, which means that they can actually make it a bill, they can make that into a law with or without the president's approval, but they do have to have a large majority of Congress to get that done. The next principle of the Constitution is federalism. Federalism is the federal government sharing and dividing power between and among different levels of government. So the federal government shares power with the state of North Carolina and with the local levels of government. So they share power with North Carolina, Cumberland County, City of Fayetteville. So they're sharing their powers throughout to help ensure the true will and safety of the American people. Like the federal government can't do everything on its own, so it needs help. So that's why it shares and divides power up. A really good example of federalism would be like taxes. So when you look at taxes, you pay a federal income tax and you also pay a North Carolina state income tax. Both levels of government have the ability to tax you. They have the power, they share the power of taxation. So when you look at federalism, what it's really allowing the government to do is to operate effectively. Most of your law enforcement comes from local area governments. It doesn't really come from the federal government. When you're thinking about the everyday, like ensuring the safety of the people by executing and enforcing the law, that would really be more of your local area government, like the city of Fayetteville, the police, or the county, the sheriff department. But the federal government has to share this power in order to really protect our basic rights. Flexibility is the last principle of the Constitution. And when you look at flexibility, it's kind of like a rubber band. You can expand the size of the government, but you can also like shrink it back down. What flexibility allows the government to do is change with time. They're writing the Constitution in the 1780s, and that is not our country today. So as time has gone on, our needs, our like desires have changed as a people. So because the government is allowed to change with time, it's better able to take care of the United States citizens. So like we looked at like the First Amendment. When you look at the First Amendment, we have reread that amendment a lot. Originally, it's just freedom of speech is verbal. And then as time goes on, we're like, you know what? Speech can be verbal, but it can also be nonverbal. So they start looking at the different ways of how you read an amendment. And that's flexibility. So the courts pretty much do that. So you can do court cases, which would be a very informal way to change the government, but you can also do amendments. And we've had 27 amendments, formal changes added to the Constitution. Question 2 is which clause is described below? So no law is above the U.S. Constitution. That's the supremacy clause. So if a state creates a law that violates the United States Constitution, then the law is not allowed. So like North Carolina has, you can't desecrate, you can't burn the U.S. flag. Well, technically you can. Okay, so we looked at Texas versus Johnson. Texas versus Johnson, the Supreme Court ruled that that is protected under your First Amendment rights. So if North Carolina tried to enforce the law, North Carolina would get in trouble because it's the supremacy clause. The U.S. Constitution is above the North Carolina laws. The Constitution applies for all the United States. The next one is the United States government cannot create a state-mandated religion. And this is a part of that First Amendment. There's an establishment clause. The U.S. government and state governments and city governments, all governments in the U.S., are not allowed to establish or create a state government. So when you have like on the money it says in God we trust, or like when presidents swear in, or when you swear into a courtroom, you're swearing to a generic God. It's not a Christian God, it's just a generic God. So the next one is all licenses and debts will be recognized from state to state. This is the full faith and credit clause. This is like when you have your driver's license in North Carolina, you can drive throughout the United States. Now, if you move to a state and you change your residency, you have to change the driver's license. But technically, while you're driving and you're going down to Florida and you want to go to, Disney World, that's cool. You don't have to stop at every single state along the way to get a new license. Your license will be recognized in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Same thing with your debt. So your credit, your debt will follow you from state to state. The next one is the United States government is allowed to expand its powers as needed to govern the nation. So this is that necessary and proper or the elastic clause. And this is the one that the government uses to expand the size of the government. So after 9/11, okay, we had a terrorist attack. The government decided to create a new department for the government. They created the Department of Homeland Security. That's using the necessary and proper clause. So how the government uses the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause is that there's something written in the Constitution that says, you can protect the U.S. citizens. So from that, they use an implied power and they create something that would be connected to ensuring our safety. So that's how they did the Department of Homeland Security. Question 3 is which power is actually stated in the United States Constitution, and you had to give an example. Powers that are stated are called delegated, enumerated, expressed. These are powers that are actually given to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution. And one of them is to coin money or coin currency. So they can actually make our money. So that is what the federal government does. They create one U.S. dollar, one U.S. currency for this country. Question 4 is which power is given to the states. So a good example would be, it's called reserve powers, but a good example of a reserve power would be like education. The federal government, when they're writing the U.S. Constitution, when our founding fathers are writing it, they don't actually create a requirement that states or the country had to give an education. So as time went on, when we're looking at the progressive era in American history, people started to say we need to have a state mandated education system. So they created it, but it's states. Now, the United States government does have power in education. Their power is through money. So if a state takes the money from the federal government, then they do have to follow federal mandates on education. So there are things that the federal government does require every state to provide, and they do it through the system of money. So if you take U.S. federal dollars for your education program, which just about every state does, they go ahead and they have to follow federal laws, federal rules on what you provide for kids and how you do it. Okay. All right. The next question. Question 5 is which power allows the United States government to expand its powers by using a delegated power? And you had to give an example. So this is implied powers. So what they do is there's something actually written in the United States Constitution, like coin currency, and they take that and they expand from it. So it's like you can siphon off power, you can siphon off another like job, another thing that you can create through something that's actually worded there. So like coin currency, okay, so you would, circle that and then put all the words that you would associate outside of it, like a little spider web. And then what you would see is, okay, well, if you have money, you need a bank. And so they created a national bank. The same thing with the Department of Homeland Security. In the Constitution says that the government has to provide for our common defense. So what they decided to do was take that wording and then they created this brand new government agency that is meant to protect us from future terrorist attacks. It's supposed to prevent them. So question 6 is which power is shared between the United States government and state governments? And then you had to give an example. One is a concurrent power, and concurrent power is sharing, and the power of taxing and taxation is definitely a concurrent power. So every single April, you have to file your income taxes for North Carolina and for the United States government. That makes it a concurrent power. They share the power of taxation. And that's a good example of like federalism as well. So number 7 is why does the U.S. government share powers with the state and local government? It's to ensure that the government can provide for our law and order, our safety for our country. So the reason why federalism exists is to ensure that this country can prosper, that this country can protect its citizens and do well in that protection. Number 8, you had to do which amendment. So you just had to put the number. So no illegal search and seizure is the 4th Amendment. Remember, 4 looks like a house. So draw an extra line. They can't come in your house unless they have a legitimate search warrant. The next one, right to an attorney in a speedy trial, is the 6th Amendment. So imagine 6 on little roller skates with a briefcase. As soon as someone is arrested for felony cases, an attorney will be provided for them, or they can provide their own attorney, but the state is technically required to give all people accused of felonies a lawyer. The 11th Amendment states that foreign governments cannot sue a state like North Carolina. If they want to sue, they have to sue the United States government. So no suits against states. The First Amendment is wraps, so religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. So if you remember wraps, you have the First Amendment. It's your first basic 5 freedoms.